Why horror is scarier with weapons. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is MauLer, and I'm still working on some side projects that are well on their way, but first, let's look at a little video that a humble viewer shared with me. It seems well liked, so I imagine it brings in some interesting points, but I must say that I immediately feel as though it's not a binary decision. Most games come with a plethora of different choices in terms of design, and the same goes for genres such as horror. Whether or not there is weaponry is irrelevant, it's about how it's used. I would say Amnesia is a prime example of effective horror without weaponry. Fear is effective horror with weaponry. Husk is a kind of terrible horror game without weaponry, and Resident Evil 5 is kind of a terrible horror game with weaponry. Oh, and I like Resident Evil 5, I just mean it doesn't really work as a horror game. It isn't the presence of weapons that defines the effectiveness of the horror. It's more about how they're used. But which would offer more potential? I don't think guns do, but I am happy to hear the argument, so let's get into it.
Our favorite games are often the ones that make us feel these really cool, powerful things. How'd you feel when you met your first Colossus, or what'd you feel when you saw Rapture for the first time? I think the best games stick with us because everything about them, from mechanics to presentation, is all about crafting that perfect, powerful moment.
Well, what an unfortunate beginning. The best games sure do have iconic moments and certain feelings of catharsis when performing certain actions. But how about we take 3 favorites of mine from different genres. Metroid Prime, a game where the enjoyment of exploration and puzzle solving while retaining memory of significant tells in objects or the architecture describe the world and how to traverse it. The game has some more significant moments and certain sequences that stand out, but they weren't what made it so special. That same idea carries over to Super Metroid. My memory from those games isn't the bit where Ridley attacked, or the bit where I unlocked a certain item. No, it was the traveling through the unknown worlds to strengthen myself and my understanding. The experience as a whole, not a particular moment. So what about The Binding of Isaac, a game focused on performing as best you can against random enemies with random items to unlock more features and beat bosses? There's no perfect, powerful moment here aside from the results screen and unlocking things. The game itself is the engaging and rewarding part, being challenged throughout a sequence of levels to reach the conclusion. But okay, maybe he meant horror games. But Amnesia has its perfect moments everywhere. The whole game is about oppressive feelings of darkness and fragility that you are trying so very hard to overcome. That is the experience throughout, though I can agree it's punctuated by the arrival of certain creatures, but is nevertheless sustained in highs and lows throughout the game. To be honest, it takes away from a lot of the greatest games in the world to say that they lead to one moment to remember. Some are genuinely a non-stop fantastic experience, not to mention this essentially removes multiplayer games from even being analyzed.
I've played so many games that fail to deliver that perfect moment because they're all focused on just one facet of the game, prioritizing one element or idea at the expense of all others.
What games do that? Like, I'm assuming you don't mean BioShock. What games focus on one element and suffer for it? Loads of games really do narrow their focus and can be fantastic for it, so please, give me an example? Please?
Horror is, in a way, the perfect genre. Practically every other genre is named after its mechanics, strategy, simulation, shooter, and so on. But horror, in contrast, is all about the experience. Everything in a horror game, from its mechanics to sound to presentation, is all about crafting one specific emotion.
Well, that's not true, is it? A genre dictates many things from tone to mechanics, and it is entirely contextual. We don't have people saying, "Excuse me, old boy, but what genre is this?" And then someone says, "Oh, it's an action fighter adventure." And they say, "Ah, well, I know exactly what to expect now." This doesn't really happen. A genre really tells you much about a game because, well, take for example H1Z1, Don't Starve, Minecraft, Amnesia. All of them are considered survival games, yet feel completely different. This theory that horror is the genre that is defined by feeling and mechanics all in one is basically moot when you consider that Five Nights at Freddy's and Dead Rising are considered horror games while providing completely different feelings throughout playing the games. Horror as a genre is one thing, but I think you're forgetting that walking simulators is what Outlast and Amnesia essentially are considered. Horror is like all other genres, you can use the label to describe the tone or the mechanics. If someone asks what Fallout New Vegas is in terms of genre, you can say RPG, but that won't tell them about the gameplay. You'd have to say action FPS. This works the same way for horror. The subject is complicated and, to be fair, not entirely defined, so I found your statement interesting and basically wrong. Horror doesn't really describe gameplay, and sometimes not even the feeling that you're going to be getting in this particular game. There are so many variations from different developers that it's just a naive statement to make.
The problem, of course, is that horror, like comedy, is difficult to pull off because it's so subjective. We're all impacted by different things. Not only that, but each person's personal understanding of what horror is different.
We will hang on to this statement.
In the game's heyday, one key bit of praise stuck out to me. Practically everyone I knew said the same thing. It's scary because you can't fight back.
Everyone you knew was an idiot. The inability to fight back alone is not what makes the game terrifying. Though I imagine that if you managed to talk to these people extensively, they would probably realize that themselves, you know, because if we just took Mario and made it so that he couldn't do anything to hurt enemies, it wouldn't make it as scary as Amnesia. You know, it's more complicated than that.
Something about this has never sat right with me. 6 years later, here I am, still thinking about that statement, and it feels just as wrong to me now as it did the first time I heard it.
That's because it's wrong.
Something about this just doesn't work for me. As I think about all the horror games that have actually scared me, every single one of them have featured some kind of combat.
So, you weren't scared by Amnesia, or you were? Do you consider Amnesia scary, or do you not? Does Amnesia not feature weapons? Like, it doesn't, right? So, unless you count throwing rocks. Do you think Amnesia worked, or didn't it?
Many people describe horror as that feeling of creeping dread before they see something bad happen. That's a very powerful emotion, and I totally get the appeal, but there's just one problem. That's not horror. That's a different emotion entirely. That's terror. Terror is the gradually growing worry that something isn't right, that chill down your spine as uncertainty grips you. Terror is worrying that you're about to confront a monster. Horror is confronting the monster.
Yeah, no, just because you define it that way doesn't make it true. When I heard this the first time around, I was like, that doesn't seem right, but let's trust him. Then I looked up the definitions. Horror is an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust, while terror is considered extreme fear. This means they can be kind of used interchangeably, and that the friend that told him this simply needed to further explain how and why they felt the way they did to, you know, keep the conversation going. Since they were using the word as its primary definition, not to mention, how do you even explain being terrorized by a creature? By your definition, terror stops the moment the monster arrives. That's simply inaccurate. God, I'm only about on my, 5th analytical series into my YouTube thing, and I'm already so tired of people using words with no care for, how they work, what they're meant to mean. They just use their own personal definition. This isn't hard to look up. This is what I did. I was like, that doesn't seem to make too much sense. I'll just Google it, and...
The genre of horror, then, is a combination of terror and horror. It's a genre made up of these two complementary emotions, themselves composites of emotions like anxiety and disgust.
Therefore, it is comprised of a whole host of emotions, not the least of which is relief, the feeling of safety and satisfaction. That is way too complicated to just say that horror consists of horror and terror, with a bit of other stuff. You're going off the rails here, buddy.
When someone says they want true horror but refers to that sense of creeping dread, what they really want is terror. But terror and horror are two halves of the same whole. You can't have one without the other.
What the hell are you talking about? We just established that there's a whole host of emotions one can feel. If we ran with your erroneous definitions of horror and terror, then we can surmise that it isn't even possible for a game to have horror without terror. What horror game only has scares? What game has no build-up at all? Literally, even Five Nights at Freddy's has a night with no enemies at the beginning to set the tone and to raise the tension. However, on the flip side, you could have a game that is entirely atmospheric horror. A game, well, like Amnesia, if it ended after the first hour and a half. If you hit credits, that, by definition, would have been a terror-only horror game. And it certainly would have worked. I mean, people's biggest scares can come from the opening in that game when there's absolutely no threat. So, yeah, do you see why your definitions are hurting my brain?
Many horror movie directors use these two emotions to powerful effect. Alien spends a long time building up the terror before Ripley's horrific confrontation at the end.
Ripley's confrontation is action and suspense, less so than horror. She blasts him with a full arsenal and saves the girl. Does that really sound like a horror sequence to you? You probably should have referenced Alien 1 here, but I still don't actually agree with your definition of horror versus terror anyway.
Good horror spends a lot of time setting up the actual horrific experience.
How do you explain Outlast? It takes as little as 5 minutes to get to your first horrifying experience, and the game is widely considered to be terrifying.
To put it another way, one cannot simply scale up the length of things. A great movie can go for a nice 60-40 split. That same 60-40 split won't work for a 40-hour game. 24 hours of terror followed by 16 hours of horror just won't work. It gets exhausting.
You what, mate? What game is lasting 40 hours these days for a single-player campaign? In fact, name a fucking horror game that has a 40-hour campaign. Holy shit. Yeah, I think people know that it's hard to maintain an atmosphere in that time frame, but most people found Alien Isolation to be too long, and the average completion for that is 18.5 hours. Fucking 40-hour game, mate. What?
The least frightening horror games try to be nothing but terror with just a few seconds of horror, if anything. That pacing has to change.
According to you, I mean, you aren't even naming names. You're just saying games have to do it because the bad games are games and the good games need to be games. Do you think Amnesia is good or bad? It's in the background for a reason, I assume.
Other games, especially open-world titles, run the gamut of emotion. Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl has elements of horror, but it also features adrenaline-pumping action, melancholy, loneliness, disappointment, and so on.
Huh. Kind of like a lot of games in the horror genre, like Amnesia with its questions of morality, Outlast with its questions of ethics, Five Nights at Freddy's with its mysterious storytelling that give players more than just scares. But I assume you don't count any of them. I wouldn't know because you're not giving me examples of when games have done it wrong. I mean, you're just leaving Amnesia in the background. Are you telling me Amnesia sucks? Or not?
For a video game to work, you need terror, then horror, then more terror, followed by more horror.
Well, back up boys, we're going home. He's got it right there. Also, did you catch him say that this was the formula for video games, not even just horror?
For a video game to work, you need terror.
You gotta watch what you say there. Things are starting to sound silly. He then talks about how these games need highs and lows and how this works well for games like Resident Evil where others fail at this. Once again, not giving examples of the failures, and then there's this.
This brings us to the first flaw in the no weapons horror game argument's armor. A great deal of these sorts of games try to hang on to that single emotion of terror too long. They want you to feel a state of constant, never-ending dread. The problem is, that's exhausting. It's why I think so many people want to laugh about it on YouTube. It's hard to take that kind of fear at face value. It's much easier to turn it into a comedy routine.
Even though you were the one who said this earlier.
The problem, of course, is that horror, like comedy, is difficult to pull off because it's so subjective. We're all impacted by different things.
Are you now speaking for yourself or everyone? Like, how do you reconcile these two things?
But even when weaponless horror games balance the ebb of terror and flow of horror flawlessly, they still lose my interest, and it's because there's no way to fight back.
You don't like games where you can't fight back because you can't fight back. Okay, it sounds like you have a particular taste.
Here's the idea behind a weaponless horror game. Vulnerability generates fear. If you can't fight back, you're more vulnerable, and therefore you're more scared. By reducing your options to simply run or hide, a horror game should be much scarier than the one where you have a gun.
Well, no, I discussed this in my extensive Amnesia vs. Soma video, but this is entirely based upon the effectiveness of the weapon, not its existence. What will a pistol do against a Terminator, I wonder? Or a bazooka, what would that do against, I don't know, a ghost?
The first mistaken assumption at play here is that fewer options make games scarier. The weaponless horror game strips the experience down. It's all about the terror, and the only way of solving a problem is to either run or hide. The problem with that assumption is this. The key to great horror is uncertainty. Horror, especially in games, works when it's dynamic. Something happens which leads to a new action, but then a complication arises.
You can't just say that. It's so dependent on the context, it's unreal. Are you saying that because Amnesia has a similar threat throughout the game that it isn't a good horror game? How is this Outlast footage an example of limited options? You have a goal, activate switches and turn on valves while evading a psychopath. You can hide, block him with doors, or generally try to outrun him and juke him. He's clearly well built, so why would you want to fight him? He's literally crazy. And he has a weapon, especially when you don't have a gun. The sequence works quite well because you can actually play it in stealth. Did you think that adding a gun to the scenario would improve it? Like you could shoot the guy and he would die? No, that would suck. How about shoot him and he just falls over and then gets back up? That's scary, right? No.
Instead of mere escalation, a good horror experience is a series of actions followed by consequences that change our understanding of the situation.
Oh, like Soma does. You know, as you progress through the game and interact with the hostile and non-hostile life, it changes your definition of life itself.
The second, even more mistaken assumption of the weapons aren't scary argument is that having a gun makes you feel safe. This couldn't be further from the truth. Guns add variety to the game and capitalize on a key component of the adrenaline rush that fuels fear, the audience's urge to fight. Players with guns have to balance the fight or flight response. A weaponless horror game can only offer the player flight.
Except for the horror games that change up this formula and provide scenarios in which the enemies aren't that which are escaped by running. In fact, you must move slowly or look away from them. That kind of variation exists, but let's not talk about it, I guess.
Not only that, but guns are not empowering. Sure, you could give the player a Frank West-size arsenal and send him off to fight all the monsters you want, and it would be fun. Even when a weapon is powerful, like the smart gun in Aliens, it still serves the vital purpose of keeping the pacing interesting. One moment you're scared, the next you feel relief as you start killing monsters. All too soon, the gun's out of ammo and you're left with memories of that brief empowerment. It accentuates the fear.
No, it can accentuate the fear. It's not a guarantee. A game like Dead Rising, which you so rightly referenced, isn't one for creating a horror atmosphere when you can mow through hundreds of enemies easily. A game like Alien vs. Predator, where your weapon is inefficient at killing enemies that can insta-kill you, maintains the scares that you're talking about. Let's reference games to make our points, please.
A well-designed weapon in a horror game complicates the decision-making process. It encourages you to come out of your hiding place, makes you question whether you should really flee. In a weaponless horror games, your options are clear. Having a gun makes you ask, can I take him? Followed by, what happens if I can't? And what if firing this gun alerts other monsters to my presence?
Yes, that is indeed one application of a mechanic in a video game that has indeed been done well and likely be done in the future and will be a part of a game that will or was good or bad depending on a plethora of other important details. As if this one interaction is what makes or breaks the game itself. Does having the ability to destroy the WoW in Soma count as having to make an important decision? One that raises questions? Is that a similar thing or is that a different thing?
A well-designed weapon in a horror game isn't an answer, it's a host of questions. It's a what-if generator. A well-designed weapon in a horror game not only introduces uncertainty, it gets you into trouble. Consider the scariest moment in Alien. Dallas enters the Nostromo's duct system to flush the alien out, but the alien takes him by surprise and Dallas disappears. It's a moment that only happened because the crew had flamethrowers and thought they could take the alien on.
Okay, first of all, there are plenty of terrifying moments in Alien that don't have anything to do with people having weaponry. Secondly, they have had the ability to use the flamethrower for ages, but their plan now is to try and kill the thing. How are they going to do that, you ask? By moving it to the airlock and releasing it into space. Not to mention that Ash is the one that suggests the fire being used as a strategy to move the alien for Dallas.
That's the only thing we don't know about is temperature.
Okay, what about temperature? What happens if we change it?
I mean, most animals retreat from fire, yes?
Which raises the question of what Ash's motives were here because of what we find out later in the actual movie. Besides, this was a desperate move. They did this out of desperation. It wasn't something they were constantly thinking about because they had the flamethrower. I think it's bizarre that you reference one scary moment from one horror movie to support your point without recognizing that you could do this for any point. Each of the characters wore shoes in this scene. This added to the tension because if they were barefoot, it would have been unrealistic. Basically, the fact that they come up with this idea to try and scare the alien into the airlock with a flamethrower in the air ducts does not mean that weaponry should be in horror games, or that weapons in horror games are better than ones without it. It's all contextual, my man.
The flamethrower grants you some breathing room because it can cause the alien to run away, if only for a moment. This enhances the emotional pacing of the game. Having a flamethrower also means you're more likely to take risks, like Dallas did, which puts you in far more vulnerable positions than you would be if you didn't have a gun.
You're telling me that having an ability to temporarily get the alien away from you encourages you to enter scenarios that you may have otherwise not entered. First, what you're describing sounds like a get-out-of-jail-free card that can be used multiple times to counteract the alien, which would naturally reduce its overall presence. Like, hey, I would normally not go here, but now I have a flamethrower, why the fuck not? Secondly, your admission that you wouldn't enter scenarios without that flamethrower tells me that you had a greater sense of fear previously to acquiring that weapon, since it gave you power and control over the situation, hardly making you feel more helpless. Thirdly, the fact that you've told us that this is just how it plays out while also saying this.
The problem, of course, is that horror, like comedy, is difficult to pull off because it's so subjective. We're all impacted by different things.
It makes me think that you're just presenting your own perspective, and I have to be honest, I think that the style that Amnesia popularized has gotten boring and needs an update, which is pretty much what Soma tried to do. If you don't believe me, watch my series about it. However, I agree with the fact that it's getting stale and PT was the new trendsetter. Try playing Layers of Fear or check out the trailer for Allison Road, games that can create intense horror without weaponry and, to be honest, would be bizarre if they had weaponry. It's funny since the arsenal they provide in Resident Evil 7 is exactly what begins to ruin the fantastic atmosphere that was focused in the opening hour.
Once I got the flamethrower, however, not only was I taking stupid risks, but I was constantly worrying about ammo. I was taking chances to get more, or I was panicking because I only had 100 ammo and I'd have felt a lot safer with 400. It's irrational, sure, that I felt more afraid with 100 flamethrower fuel than with 0, but having the gun meant worrying about inventory. Alien Isolation was so much scarier when I had to keep an eye on my fuel gauge.
You are literally describing resource management, which is a staple of survival and is present in both Outlast and Amnesia. Interestingly, it's an incredible immersive and terrifying resource to manage. Light. Literally just light. The ability to see is something you need to treat carefully. Clever stuff in an atmospheric survival horror for boosting that sense of helplessness, especially when the control of it is given to you.
Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth is one of my favorite horror games because one of the levels gives you a gun, but you're told not to use it because you don't have enough ammo to fight off everyone who arrives after hearing a gunshot. You have a gun, but now you're terrified of accidentally pulling the trigger and calling down a horde of eldritch monsters on your head. The scariest thing in the level is the gun in your hand. That's what guns add to horror.
No, that's what guns can add to horror. And that scenario was just one that may not work in every game. Come on, man, this isn't hard.
That's what guns add to horror, but they have one other benefit. In games, death means very little. It's not really death, it's a means of resetting a fail state. Try, fail, die, try again. Horror doesn't work when you're not in mortal jeopardy, and if you die frequently, then things aren't so scary. Likewise, if a situation is predictable, then it loses any sense of risk.
I completely agree.
I played a bit of Soma on a friend's account and found it boring because it was clear when the designers wanted me to be fearful as opposed to when they didn't. The opening is creepy, sure, but it's so blatantly artificial that a momentary startle is easily forgotten. You can stride with confidence through a level.
That's it? That's all you're gonna say about Soma? Wow. Well, okay, so saying it's creepy and artificial is meaningless to me, without any kind of example. And telling me you can strive through the game is something you can do with all horror games, it's just not recommended. So if you're interested in knowing what you missed in Soma, Stomp, then I suggest you check out my series on it. Might clear up some of them design choices for you. On a serious note to my subscribers though, did you catch that? Soma being run into the dirt again from someone who didn't play past the first hour of it. Yay, the philosophical questioning and delivery will be completely ignored because it didn't scare him right, or apparently should have provided him a weapon.
Having a weapon introduces a system of risk and reward. Instead of walking with confidence through an unconvincing haunted house, a weapon might help keep deaths at bay, reducing the frequency of death and, as a result, preserving the intensity of the moment. Losing resources like ammunition, which you wouldn't have in a weaponless horror game, can make death sting that much more.
He says, as he clearly picks up a manageable resource in Outlast, a weaponless horror game. Why do people never look at the footage they put in their own videos?
So yes, absolutely, weapons can make you more confident, but that's fine because it makes horror that much better. Confidence leads to far more dramatic decisions. Weapons introduce uncertainty into your decision-making process, and then they complicate everything by giving you more things to worry about. They keep death from becoming rote. If anything, they give it weight.
Okay, and removing weapons from horror games makes them scarier because you have no way to defend yourself and you're forced to find any and all ways of either escaping your enemy, delaying them, or trapping them. This creates more options than simply firing a weapon and will put you in a scenario that you previously wouldn't have thought of being in. You see, Stomp? Anyone can do this. It's honestly just a perspective that isn't supported by much data. How do you reconcile that horror is better with weapons when Outlast and Amnesia and Five Nights at Freddy's are so successful in their genres? How do you justify that? I mean, I could, but I want to hear you do it.
Weapons, especially guns, absolutely make horror games scarier. I don't expect you to agree with me, but I do hope I've given you some food for thought.
Are you fucking kidding? You state it like a fact at the end, and then you say you're welcome to disagree. People don't know how English works. What you're supposed to say is that I think horror is always better, and you may think differently, instead of...
Weapons, especially guns, absolutely make horror games scarier.
No. Your fact is... fake news. Plenty of incredible games would not have been improved in terms of scares by adding fucking weapons. Not only that, but I don't believe that you're being honest about your bias. I think you really haven't understood that what made Amnesia and Outlast work so well is a complex set of design choices. And conversely, what made games like Silent Hill and the original Resident Evil work were completely different sets of reasons. Regardless, thanks for trying. Oh, and by the way guys, I'm working on a new series, but in the meantime, hopefully this video will tie you over, as well as another one I'll be releasing soon enough. If you want to see any updates about it, I will be posting them to my Patreon, which should be linked here, I guess. Thanks for watching, folks, and I will see you next time.